Greetings, my underlings. The topic of the day is going to be Subtlety Rogue. As I said last video about Mage, we were going over a healer spec next, so this will be a lesson to never fully trust me, because today we are going to interface ourselves into Subtlety Rogue. So, Subtlety as a rogue is in a quite interesting situation. As we said multiple times by now, whenever we go over and we look at the performance of the DPS specs in raid encounters, we have told the plebs how much Rogue was performing, how well Rogue was performing for several weeks, for pretty much this entire tier. We also went and looked at Mythic Plus, and we also noted how well Subtlety was doing in Mythic Plus. It is currently basically the main choice as a melee spec for your Mythic Plus groups of very, very high keys, top keys, together with Windwalker Monk. But however, there is one peculiar thing about Rogue, which is the fact that they are not actually, for whatever reason, you can pull out your inner psychiatrist and try to come up with a reason. Rogue is actually not a very popular class as a whole. You know, if we were to take all of the rogues in Mythic raiding together and use them as a single spec, they would actually be below 4 other. They would still be less popular than Balance Druid, than Beast Mastery Hunter, than Havoc, Demon Hunter, and than Arms Warrior. And in Mythic Plus as well, we just said that Subtlety is one of the more powerful of the melee DPS specs for Mythic Plus, and yet, if we look at all of the keys, so what all of the players are going for in terms of play rate, both warrior specs are far above the play rate of Subtlety. Red Paladin is also far ahead. They are even beaten by Unholy DK, they are beaten by Windwalker, they are beaten by Havoc. They are not as popular as their power would suggest. Usually, very often you are used to the most popular spec being the strongest one. You start seeing them everywhere. Case in point, Balanced Druids or Hunters or Havoc Demon Hunters, for example. Mage, when it's popular, it's everywhere. But that's not really the thing for Rogue. So it is a quite interesting situation where one of the better performing, we might even have a case for the best overall performing DPS spec in the entire game for PvE content, is actually nowhere near being the most popular one. So let's go over and see how this spec works and functions within their talent choices, their options for legendaries, and their covenant choices, perhaps looking in the future about their incoming tier set, how the spec works, their rotation, their burst windows between single target, AOE, raid encounters, Mythic Plus, and whatnot. The first thing we're looking at, of course, as is tradition, is their diversity and how many things you can change and tinker with when you're playing as a Subtlety Rogue. So Subtlety is not that streamlined when it comes to choosing your talent options. They do have a handful of choices within the first and the last row when it comes to damage, and their crowd control row as well, but that is a little bit less important. Generally speaking, they will be picking Weapon Master and Master of Shadows whenever they are in raid encounters and more single target focused fights, whereas when they are back in Mythic Plus, they are going for Premeditation and Shuriken Tornado. Premeditation is somewhat self-explanatory, since entering stealth is something you can abuse much more often in Mythic Plus, thanks to not being in combat for a long time and being able to re-enter stealth normally, so it gets a much higher value in Mythic Plus, as well as picking Shuriken Tornado for pure AoE as your last talent. Shuriken Tornado is not even that strong. The bigger problem as far as AoE picks go for Subtlety is that Secret Techniques, the other new addition of Shadowlands as a finisher for AoE, doesn't function, doesn't interact with your passive, your Find Weakness passive, which makes this talent basically terrible. So as far as AoE goes, you just go for the next best thing, which is Shuriken Tornado. As far as conduit options go, you do have a handful of choices for the non-damage part of your picks, because your damage choices are quite locked. Being, as we will talk soon, that you are most likely Ventier for all content, you will be playing with Lashing Scars and Deeper Daggers as your two potency conduit options. They are far and away overperforming the other conduits, so there's not really any any variety that is going to happen as far as damage is concerned in your Conduits either. What about instead your legendary picks, your options for legendaries, especially with the eye on 9.2, where you will be able to use 2 of them? Well, very luckily, you are one of the blessed specs, which has the bonus of having the Covenant legendary as your strongest legendary. This means that when 9.2 comes out, you won't really have to sweat. You won't have to sweat because you will be able to choose whichever best legendary you want, since your other legendary is your Covenant one, the one you would have to pick anyways. So Obedience, the Covenant legendary of Ventir that goes to empower Flagellation, is your standard pick as a sub-rogue. You can, very likely, simply go back to pair Obedience with what you were using before Obedience came in the game, which is Finality, to buff your finishers even more. This seems to be the most straightforward of picks whenever it comes to double legendaries, both for single target and for AOE situations, whether it's raiding or Mythic Plus. It looks like it's the most standard of choices, and as we said, mostly the same goes for Covenants. Ventir is your main pick. Kyrian is not bad, particularly in Mythic Plus, but it is likely you will be staying as Ventir regardless. Now, besides the variety and the options you have, what about the spec itself, how it plays and how it functions? So, Subtlety historically has been a quite well scaling spec into the expansion. So, scaling, the TLDR is that the more stats you get, the more benefit you can get from these stats. Certain specs don't work as well as others because some of their passives, some of their inner workings don't really benefit too much from gaining stats over the course of an expansion, and other specs instead work quite well. Subtlety historically has been quite well in terms of scaling. Their mastery is very good, straight up buffing your finisher damage. It used to be stronger because nowadays there is a lot of secondary and tertiary sources of damage that lower essentially the damage that your finishers can do. For example, if you look at this single target damage window of a Subtlety Rogue, you will see that Winds of Winter is topping the damage meter, and then there is the melee damage, the Shadow Strike, your Banshee's Blight effect from your special dagger from the raid, Flagellation, the Trinket. So effectively your finisher damage has gotten quite low over the course of the game, so your mastery is not as strong as it was before, but you also have the help of your good old faithfuls. You have Relentless Strikes and Shadow Techniques, which are very good for scaling. And I will give you the comparison for better understanding. You know, this is a Sludge Fist fight from a year ago, and this is a Guardian fight from basically a few days ago. Even though they are 1 year apart, they are several dozen item levels apart, and you can see that when it comes to the effect of Shadow Techniques in giving you back combo points, you can see that Guardian is giving you way more Shadow Technique combo points than Sludge Fist does. Not only that, but you have a very similar amount of Shadow Strike casts, despite the fact that Sludge Fist is 1 minute longer of a fight. The other example is the energy gain you get from Relentless Strikes. You can see the energy gain is basically identical, and once again the energy you gain from Shadow Techniques is much higher for the Guardian fight in Sanctum of Domination, and once again this is despite the fact that Sludge Fist is 1 minute longer. So you would have even more time to get benefits from this, and yet you don't. This is because over the course of the expansion, over time, those passives get stronger because your secondaries get higher, the effects of this becomes more empowered, and you become stronger as a result. You don't need to be buffed, you don't need to be tuned, you don't need to have some borrowed power in terms of tier sets or legendaries to help you out. It's your own kit, it's your own base power of your class and your spec that makes you stronger throughout the course of an expansion. So, when it comes to your damage as a Subtlety Rogue, it is quite straightforward and divided into windows, very similar to Fire Mage. The only difference is that you get to do it more often, because of course your Shadow Dance becomes active and available way more often than Combustion, but the result is roughly the same. You know, this is your average damage window, your damage spikes of a Subtlety Rogue. You can see there is quite a handful of spikes of damage, not really very far apart. This is because when you look at it, the green segments are the ones when your Shadow Dance is active. And you can still see that some of the spikes are higher than the others, even within your Shadow Dance windows, and that is because of flagellation. So your actual only serious main cooldown is what gives you the higher spikes throughout the course of an encounter. The rest of the minor, smaller spikes of damage are simply your run-of-the-mill Shadow Dance rotation, which is going to look like this, very, very simply. You will go into Shadow Dance and you will keep using Shadow Strikes until you're capping or near capping in combo points, use Eviscerate and go again. Before he will get to use Symbols of Death roughly 50% of the time. That's basically the availability of Symbols of Death, and it's 30-second cooldown, so it's gonna look roughly like this. The amount of symbols usages compared to your Shadow Dance usages. Besides this, the rotation is going to look the same. Outside of your combustion window version of rogues, outside your Shadow Dance, you go back once again very similarly to a Fire Mage to basically go AFK. Yeah, you enter maintenance mode. You just use your backstab every once in a while, use your finisher. The rest is just setting up for the next round of Shadow Dance or Shadow Dances. It's refresh your Slice and Dice, refresh your Rapture, make sure that you don't have to do anything else when you are in Shadow Dance other than Shadow Strike and Eviscerate, and then once you go out of Shadow Dance you can go back to keeping up your buffs and your debuffs on the target. If you are fighting multiple targets, usually 3 or more, you are basically going to change your combustion window, your Shadow Dance window, with 2 different abilities. Instead of using Shadow Strike and Eviscerate for single target, you're going to move over and use Shuriken Storm and Black Powder. But it is going to be pretty much the exact same. The only difference is that thanks to Shuriken Storm giving you 1 combo point per target hit, most of the time you will be able to do Spender, Finisher, Spender, Finisher. You won't need multiple Shadow Strikes to get to full combo points for your Eviscerate because Shuriken Storm is going to take care of it in a single cast. So for both Single Target and AOE, it is going to be a very divisive rotation depending on whether or not you are within Shadow Dance or outside of Shadow Dance. The downtime period is going to be one of slow usage of abilities, maintenance of buffs and debuffs, and getting ready for your Shadow Dance window, which will become more hectic, more pressed and condensed in what you want to do within those few GCDs you have, and then you go back to the laid-back chill period before using Shadow Dance again. Now, it might be transpiring already that because of this type of damage profile, how you want to do damage, you have a very consistent type of damage. Even in your burst window, so to speak, your burst is not exceptional. Both the Single Target one and even the AOE one, you're not particularly at the top of the consideration whenever you look and think about burst, you know. If you're looking at AOE, both the consistent AOE or the burst AOE, you can think about Elemental Shaman, you can think about even Frost Mage, Havoc, Demon Hunter. Subtlety Rogue is not particularly exceptional in that. Even the burst Single Target Subtlety Rogue is just, it doesn't really have much, you know, outside of Flagellation, as we said, which is certainly a strong cooldown that can contribute a lot. Outside of that, the rest of your rotation is going to stay the same throughout the encounter, so your burst is not exceptional. But the key to Subtlety is how often you get to use it and how steady it can be, thanks to Shadow Dance. You know, when you are fighting a boss for roughly 4 minutes, and you get to use Shadow Dance 15 times in 4 minutes. That is essentially a 16-second cooldown. A 16-second cooldown, and Shadow Dance lasts for 8, which means you have basically a 50% uptime of Shadow Dance throughout an encounter. Does that even count as a cooldown? Something that will be active for 50% of a fight? Imagine Army of the Dead being active for 50% of an encounter. Combustion. Ravenous Frenzy being active for 50% of a fight. So the fact that your so-called cooldown is basically active very, very often, very similarly to Bestial Wrath of Beast Mastery Hunter, makes your damage very, very consistent consistent and solid over the course of a fight. So you won't have too much to do with tinkering about cooldown timings and getting ready for the perfect moment, like perhaps you have often heard in raid encounters when you hear raid leaders trying to wrap their heads around where they can fit the next combustion, the next ravenous frenzy, the next ashen hallow. This is not something that will happen for a sub-rogue. A sub-rogue will basically just have all their cooldowns whenever they need it. Now, some people might not like this type of playstyle. Some people like having, you know, a few seconds of spotlight, right? Being considered a little bit more for just a brief period. Like knowing that this is your time to shine because this is where you get to use your combustion. Or this is your time to shine because this is where you go all out with all of your paladin cooldowns. Some people like to have that type of big booming cooldown window. This is not really gonna happen. It's not really gonna be a thing for Subtlety Rogue players. You will just be consistently doing very good damage throughout the course of a fight or a Mythic Plus key. You will very likely be losing to the better AOE specs. You will very likely not see yourself at the top of the meter whenever you start a fight and you see the burst damage because you don't have too much, but in the end, after the encounter is done, you will be one of the better performing DPS specs. And what's important is that this is going to be both for single target and for AOE, at the very least if the AOE lasts long enough. And this is why Subtlety looks very good getting into 9.2. Yes, technically speaking, they got nerfed, because their 2-piece has just gotten nerfed. Now your Shadow Strike has 5% less of a chance to give you Shadow Blades, and your 4-piece has a 3% chance per combo point instead of 4 to make your next Shadow Strike cast to up to 5 enemies. So it is slightly weaker than before, but it was already decent, it was already a strong set, and it's not that you needed this to complement your rotation anyways. Not to mention, as we already said, you already look quite strong in 9.2 just because of your double legendary synergy. If you then add this synergy with the fact that you are already one of the better, if not the best performing DPS spec, it is looking very, very nice for you in 9.2. As I said at the start, it is still quite a mystery as to why exactly not many players are playing Rogue, even when they are meta, even when they are flavor of the month, flavor of the tier, and flavor of the year, they are still not too popular. Perhaps over the course of the expansions, many Rogue players have been diluted. Some Rogue players in Mists went playing Windwalker, some players since Legion went playing Demon Hunter, so now the Rogue player pool has significantly decreased. Maybe that's the reason, but overall they do look like quite a solid pick for 9.2, because this is not something, funnily enough, that has been a strong point of Rogue for the past few expansions. Rogue has not gotten very, very OP treatment in a few expansions. They have had one spec. The standout spec in the last basically 3 expansions was basically just Outlaw for Mythic Plus. That was the outlier for Rogue specs, Outlaw AoE damage in Mythic Plus keys. That was basically the thing for Rogue. In raid encounters, they were not really too much in the spotlight. They also certainly were not in 9.0. Rogue was not doing too hot. In 9.0, they got buffed over time, they became better and better in 9.1, so that people realized over time that Rogue was doing very well. So now this will be the first patch, 9.2, where we might get into it already with the knowledge that Rogue is poised to do very well in the patch, and in particular the spec we are highlighting now, Subtlety. So as I said, it is perhaps not a spec for everyone, simply because it lacks this, this closure to your rotation, lining up several cooldowns, big burst damage type of thing that many players like to see, like to do. But if you like this type of consistent damage, if you like getting excited and prepping up your next round of cooldowns that is going to happen very, very quickly thanks to Shadow Dance, this is a very good spec to play. Both in Mythic Plus it's looking great, in raid encounters it's looking very well, as far as double legendary it's looking great as well, and the tier set, while nerfed, is still powerful. So I think it was worth highlighting Subtlety in today's video, because it is poised to be the best looking, at the very least, of the DPS specs, maybe just for melee, perhaps out of all DPS specs for 9.2. So, with this being said, I can leave you to your own considerations about Rogue as a whole and about Subtlety in particular. Thank you, as usual, for watching the video and for helping to grow the channel. You can also do more, of course, by liking the video as well as commenting down below. I would like to hear, honestly, I would like to hear for non-Rogue players, the ones who have never really gotten into Rogue, what could be your reasons as to why you have not enjoyed Rogue or never tried to play Rogue in the first place, as well as, of course, you can subscribe to the channel. But this time around, the subscribe button is going to be open only to the few, apparently, Rogue players watching the video. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I have to go eat. I've been saying this for the last 7 hours, and I still have to eat. Fuck.